So the last talk today is about the risk of censorship and privacy. This is kind of like more a joke. I didn't mean to say that privacy is a risk, but there are actually some implications if you use some of the privacy solutions out there, as we will see in this talk. So before we start, can you help me to define censorship? So, is content moderation censorship? So if a miner, let's say if a miner delays the inclusion of a transaction by ignoring it, let's say in Ethereum proof of stake, right? You're the next validator, so you have the next slot, and you ignore that transaction. You leave it to the next one or to the one after. Are you then censoring transactions? What do you think? I see some people say, okay, interesting, okay. What if, what if as so in a blockchain we typically have a peer-to-peer layer, right? So nodes that are transmitting data among peers, and before they forward data, they validate whether the data is semantically correct, whether the balances are in check, whether the signatures are valid. If those forwarding nodes, who are not miners, just full nodes that relay data, if they do not relay a transaction, are they exerting censorship?
Transaction is not ends up not being regulated because yes, it is like a single node price that fails, but it can be censorship at the end. Do you need a valid transaction?
Excuse me?
Do you need a valid transaction?
Yep, a valid transaction. Assuming it's the accounts allow to issue that transaction, the semantics of the transaction are valid, and the signature is valid. So we have one proposal here. If one node does not forward it, that's not censorship. If many nodes do not forward it, resulting in the transaction not propagating at all, that's censorship. Okay, another idea?
I would say the node itself is censoring in every case, but the user is not censored if this is not done by a sufficient amount of nodes such that the peer-to-peer network is cut into two different sections.
Oh, okay. So now you're discussing eclipse attacks or partitioning of the network. So like if there's a partitioning happening, that's already censorship, you say?
Yeah, I would distinguish between a node trying to censor and the node or a group of nodes succeeding in their censorship.
Right. Okay. Mm-hmm.
The decision whether to pass a transaction, for example, is made based on the transaction itself. So, for example, a node just not propagates random transactions. It's not censorship, even if this transaction is not made.
Okay, I will just repeat for those that didn't hear. So it was proposed. There's actually the notion maybe of an intent, like if a random transaction is censored versus a transaction that has some specific logic or understanding, or I mean, some kind of let's say a privacy mixer transaction does something specific. So that should be looked differently, right? Should be investigated.
Censorship is censorship only if it also has elements of discrimination.
All right, so censorship is only censorship if it has elements of discrimination. Interesting, okay? I'm just quoting. Any other thoughts? Yeah?
I'd like to propose the idea of Wittgenstein's idea that censorship is anything that looks like censorship.
A recursive definition, very good. Thank you.
No, it's not really recursive, and I'm not offering this as a joke.
Okay.
You look at something and you can tell whether it's censorship or not. Like we all did this now with this thought experiment, and if enough of us think of something that it is censorship, that's what it is.
Okay. Very interesting. So yeah, I guess besides what is censorship, we should also ask ourselves, where does it occur, right? Again, we mentioned earlier an attacker can be on any of these layers, really. So we can have censorship on the peer-to-peer layer, on the application layer, on the consensus layer. So if you, as a validator or miner, you create a fork to censor out other blocks or a past history, a past reality of the blockchain, you might exert censorship, right? Or on the application state, if you are a UST, USDT, or USDC provider and you blacklist addresses, maybe that's a form of censorship. I'm just like speculating, right? We don't have any like common or clear definition, I feel, yet on censorship. I haven't seen anything formal. I haven't seen any papers on that either that really describe this in detail yet. Right? So again, right, we discussed, I think, most of these points that I note here. So transaction inclusion, right? What's the notion of censorship here, or when, at what point do we reach? Do we experience censorship? Is there some kind of a notion of weak or strict censorship? Yeah, it's unclear. And we have these application layer possibilities of censorship. So what we'll discuss now in this talk is where censorship is occurring, so where miners are specifically not including certain transactions, and they explicitly discriminate against certain types of smart contracts. But again, I have to give a legal disclaimer, and I'm not a lawyer, and it's not really clear what is expected if regulators want entities to censor. We do not know what they expect. We do not know with what they would be content. We do not know whether the practiced censorship that we discuss in this talk is sufficient to be regulatory compliant. And we do not know what other countries are expecting. So most of the talk is based on US sanctions, as you might have guessed. But there are many other countries, and we do not know what they kind of would like to have or expect. Because we're talking here about a shared ledger, a worldwide shared ledger, and obviously there are many interested stakeholders that might impose their like sanction rules, so to speak. So we tried to quantify a bit censorship to give you some empirical data. We looked in particular at Tornado Cash, which I'll explain a little bit later. This is the mix that we discussed earlier. So we look at data from the 1st of January 2021 to the 15th of November 2022. We found about 270,000 deposit or withdrawal events from this mixer. And there were in total roughly 230,000 distinct blocks where these deposits or these withdrawals from this mixer occurred. So we looked at additional ecosystem data, block proposers. You may know that the term proposer is a synonym for miners or validators, depending on which chain you look at. Block builders, those are the entities that actually are building blocks, and relayers, so such as Flashbots, BlockXroute, and so on. And speaking of the sanctions, so we had the Office of Foreign Asset Control in the US that publishes a list of specially designated nationals and blocked persons. So that's a list that they publish on their website, where you can currently see, as far as I remember, roughly 132 Ethereum addresses. So these are either contract addresses or addresses of externally owned accounts. This is an externally owned account is kind of like just a user address, right? As Dan described this morning, or you have a contract address, which is the address of a smart contract, of a deployed smart contract. And roughly 70% of these are contract addresses of the Tornado Cash application. There are also some externally owned accounts that are explicitly sanctioned. And most finally, there are even like some testnet addresses apparently on the Ethereum Girly testnet that are sanctioned. A testnet by definition should have no value, but they're also on that list. So we discussed very briefly earlier what a mixer is, right? So let's just look at the Tornado Cash briefly. So it's an application in which you can deposit a fixed denomination of coins. For example, like 1 Ether into the Tornado Cash pool. So you cannot deposit 1.1 or any arbitrary amount in that pool. You can only deposit 1 Ether and take 1 Ether out. Why is that? Anybody an idea?
I mean, I don't know if you can say it's quantitative, but it gives you more privacy there because you cannot observe that 1.12 ether comes in and then it comes out on the other side, so you can't actually.
Correct. So the amount could otherwise help an adversary, an observant of that contract, to link the deposit and the withdrawal transactions, right? So that's why there are fixed denominations. So if you want to push, for example, let's say 111 ether through Tornado Cash, how many deposits would you make if you know that there is a 110 and 100 ether pool? 3, right? Exactly. So 1 in the 1 ether, 1 in the 10, and 1 in the 100, right? So you need to do 3 deposits, and hopefully you withdraw them at some point later. So it really looks like this, right? So you have this mixer, 1 ether goes in from address A, and later on you want to withdraw it to an address B that's ideally not linked to address A. But who pays for the gas? Yeah.
Well, we can design both ways, I guess. Right?
Both ways. What are the options?
Oh, depositor or the withdrawer?
So if the depositor pays the gas, what's the problem with that?
You link.
You link them again, exactly. Another option?
Tornado Cash can stake the funds that it's temporarily holding, or invest them, get interest on them, and just earn from holding that money.
Right. So you can do DeFi farming on Tornado Cash assets, yes?
Add one more person just after doing so. Do you relay about?
Perfect. I see you have already used Tornado Cash, or at least looked at it. So there are so-called relayers. So the term is a bit misleading because we also call flashbots and so on relayers. So this is a different relayer, just for the sake of clarity. It's a third party which you send your proof to, your transaction to, that withdraws the transaction, that withdraws the money from the pool. And this third party will pay the gas fees on your behalf while taking a part of the withdrawal amount to be compensated for that transaction, right? So they're not doing this for free, obviously, but they can. You can agree that they take a part of this once they withdraw from the Tornado Cash pool. So the advantage of using a third party is that this third party will help at least a subset of the other users that are exiting Tornado Cash, right? And you may hope that this will, that they have a sufficient pool of users so that your anonymity is kind of protected, right? Obviously, you need to look. You need to have additional measures such as preventing browser fingerprinting, IP address leakages, etc. There are a few other side channels you may want to look at, but I don't want to spoil too much on the privacy side. Yeah.
Can you explain again the problem of the withdrawal?
Yes. Right. So if you you want to withdraw here to address B, right, for the pool, for the 1 ether pool. In order to withdraw, you need to make a transaction to the Tornado Cash contract, proving that you have the right to withdraw 1 ether, right? And for miners to execute this transaction, you need to pay fees, transaction fees, that they are willing to execute and validate your transaction. Now, you need to take these funds from somewhere. And ideally, the source of funds should be not linked to your deposit address A, right? Hence, the easiest solution is if I come to you, here I prove to you I really have a coin in that pool. I use a zero-knowledge proof for that, that the smart contract will verify. And I tell you, if you execute that transaction, you will get the fees, right? And I get the money to my new address. So then you're happy. Probably you will take a small cut, right? Like whatever 5% fee on that. But it will allow me to not be linked it will allow me to not link my new address B to my old deposit address A. That's the problem here.
Could you repeat again what is the problem with the sender paying for the using? So now you explain why receiver paying for the transaction that right?
So there are two transactions that are happening, right? This is one transaction, and this is another one, right? This is the deposit transaction, and this is the withdrawal transaction. Here, it's fine if the depositor pays from its own account, because that's before the mixer, right? So, that's fine, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you don't have privacy anyways, right? So, whether you reveal a bit more or not doesn't really matter. What's important is that you have unlinkability between where A and B got their funds from, right? You don't want this to be observable, at least not on-chain. There may be other side channels elsewhere. Yeah. Very good. So Tornado Cash was quite popular. I mean, this is only until the end of 2021 here. You just see like some rough numbers on the number of unique depositors that we measured here. I also plotted other kind of mixes, right? There's also Typhoon Cash, Cyclone, Typhoon Network. These are just like, so to speak, competitors or other types of mixers that you can use. Here, this is the breakdown of the deposits and the withdrawals respectively over time, just to give you a rough image, right? And also, maybe if you're interested, like where does this money come from? Where does it go? Just roughly, right? To give you an intuition. So we plotted here some money actually comes from TC itself. So people seem to be redepositing, which is funny. Quite a bunch of money comes from Uniswap. There are also here some attackers that are apparently using Tornado Cash. So it is a rather popular tool among attackers, it seems. But what we're really interested in today, this afternoon, is what is the impact of sanctions on Tornado Cash? Right? So you can see here in August 2020, the OFAC sanctions included the Tornado Cash contracts on their SDN list, right? As we said previously. So the understanding was that in the US, and again, I'm not fully probably paraphrasing the legal significance of this, but the idea is that US citizens should not interact with Tornado Cash. I'm not sure what interaction means. Maybe that's depositing, maybe that's withdrawing, maybe, I don't know. There should not be any economical or financial transaction with the Tornado Cash router. And what we've seen is that there was some kind of a spike here, just before or maybe during the sanctions. I guess people try to exit if they could. And then we saw that the application, that the number of deposits here, they dropped below 500, right? Like roughly on the order of 250 here. So they didn't fully stop, but they certainly had a significant decline compared to previous activity, which seemingly was growing at least, right? So it looks like regulators stepped in just before this became really popular, according to on-chain data. So that's just the raw data on Tornado Cash. So what's interesting now, if we look at the ecosystem, right, how are miners or validators responding to those sanctions, right? So here we have a similar figure with, again, the OFAC sanctions here being highlighted in August 2020. But what we're visualizing is the top 10 mining pools. And most notably Ethermine here, which mined suddenly here a few days after the sanctions almost 0 blocks with Tornado Cash transactions. Right? So you can see a significant difference in behavior from these entities, which are the validators. So the very end, the last entity that really forms the blockchain. So just to give you some recap on this proposal, I built a separation so that we can look at the next figure. So in general, on Ethereum at the moment, we have the searchers. Those are the entities that are searching for opportunities to transact, such as arbitrage, liquidations, and other types of minor extractable value. Then we have the builders. So the searchers send a transaction to the builder. The builder tries to package the block in the specific order. The builders then send their build block to the relayer, who does a sealed bid auction. So typically the block that offers the most reward to the validators is then forwarded, and the validator is then verifying and mining this block at the end. Right? So this is roughly on a very high level the flow. There are obviously some important details, but I'm skipping them for this talk here. Just for you to understand what's the role of a builder, a proposer, which is a validator, or relayer. Because what we're interested in is like, so who of the builders, relayers, or proposers are now engaging in censorship, right? So we don't really have to dive into all the details, but just for you to briefly have a look at it. So we have here, for example, we have the builders, right? So Flashbots, for example, runs their own builder, and it seems like that they have, so the green bar is supposed to be the uncensored blocks, which I define here just for the sake of example as the blocks that contain Tornado Cash transactions. And at least in our experiment here, we've seen 0 blocks at the time, right? Obviously, this can change over time, but it seems like that at least the Flashbots builders here enacted in censoring or at least trying to be somewhat compliant with OFAC sanctions. And again, I'm saying this without knowing whether this is in fact being compliant according to legal terms. Similarly for relayers, right, we can see who of the relayers are mining blocks or forwarding blocks with Tornado Cash transactions, and finally the validators. Who of the validators, so you all have for sure heard about Lido or Coinbase or Kraken, who of these are mining blocks that do contain Tornado Cash transactions, right? So we can see all this data on chain. It can be beautifully visualized. There are also great websites out there that show this in an interactive format. If you want to check out, like there is mevboost.pix, for example, which I can recommend if you guys if you're interested. Yeah, just to have an understanding. So it seems like this has really far-reaching implications on the architecture or on the behavior of the ecosystem. Right? And I think we should ask ourselves, what does that mean? What are the long-term implications of this? Right? And also, initially blockchains were at least constructed with this idea of they cannot be stopped, right? Maybe they cannot be censored. But de facto here, at least on a quantitative level, we do see some form of censorship, right? Again, we'll probably go back to our question of how do we define censorship. I mean, we do see it, so I guess it is censorship, right? Yeah. What about the application layer? So we discussed already in the earlier talk that we've seen USDT and USDC putting addresses on their blacklist. There are other coins, other contracts that have done the same. So this is just another example of censorship that we have seen. And moving a bit away from Ethereum, because we've really talked a lot about EVM chains, we've also looked into a third-party service, into a Blender, which is a mixer for Bitcoin. It's not a smart contract, as you would have guessed on Bitcoin. It's really a third-party provider that's providing mixing services on Bitcoin. Once the OFAC sanctions were applied to the Bitcoin mixer here, the activity kind of stopped, right? Which makes sense because it's a third-party provider, so it's rather trivial to shut down a few servers. It's a bit more difficult than shutting down a smart contract where the JavaScript code to interact with is still open source and people can run it on their own machines. Very good. Any questions so far on this part? Okay, then I have a question for you. So what are the security implications of censorship? Any negative consequences?
Yeah. Well, I think there's it's important how scalable censorship is. So if you can only censor a couple dozen addresses, and if that's targeted maybe at organizations that governments don't like, then that's not so significant. But if you're censoring transactions of most people, say like a lot of concerns about
government-controlled cryptocurrency is that you could, for instance, say that you have to spend money on a certain amount of your money each month or something. Then that becomes kind of, on a social level, a much bigger threat.
Okay, right. So you mean on the, or just on the inclusion side, right? That there are certain actors that can force out a certain group of people or entities, right? Any information security incidents that you could think of that would result out of this desire to censor? Yeah.
If I, as a validator or miner, censor transactions, especially proof of stake, if I censor another validator's transactions, I increase my relative stake, maybe because I censor out profit that validator can gain. So this is a security problem.
All right, but how would you censor a validator from receiving?
I just reject every if I interact with a transaction that goes like any type of arbitrage that's supposed to make profit from that market.
All right. So then the system model would be you own most of the connections, most of the network connections to a validator. Based on, let's say, Ethereum's current proof of stake, you can predict who is going to be the next validator. You do observe a profitable arbitrage opportunity, and you choose not to forward this to this validator.
Validator, I choose not to include.
Because you maybe extracted yourself. Right.
Maybe I just don't want this validator to become larger than I am. It increases my chance of validating the next one. So rather than
I mean, yeah. I mean, this is very closely related to the implications of having no secret leader election. It's that you can also avoid a new validator to join the network, right? So that's a form of censorship. I'm sure Dan has much more to talk about that and how to solve it. But yeah, so these are really important consequences. Yeah.
I think censorship is an issue for defining sensitive transactions.
Right.
And at the same time, also you need immediate action. Censoring the transaction for even a small amount of time might be a problem. I mean, not censoring it forever, but even for
So also something that Valeria mentioned, I think earlier in her talk, was the issues of denial of service. So with censorship, we kind of introduce like a new DOS vector, right? So I would like to discuss two things today. One is potential confirmation latency increase due to censorship that we could measure, but also denial of service. So what are kind of like the new, is there a new denial of service vector that is introduced through censorship, right? So let's start with latency. So we kind of want to ask ourselves, does censorship slow down transaction confirmation? So how would you measure that?
Average latency of systematic H transactions to global logic.
Right. So we could, but on system level. So how would you set it up? So what do we need? What kind of nodes do we need?
I mean, we know when transaction gets consumed, we know when transaction gets sent to the chain.
So yeah, right. So we do assume the existence of some node that monitors the mempool, right? So it's some kind of a node that listens, and as Dan said, there are many nodes, many people doing that. So we can record what's the volatile nature of this database, of this mempool database, right? At least the local view. And we can timestamp when we receive it on the network layer, and we can also like read the timestamp of the block itself in which it's mined, or in which these transactions are mined, right? And this allows us to quantify the latency at which transactions are included. It's not perfect because A, we only have a local view of the mempool, and B, the mempool is not the ground truth, right? We don't know how many seconds the transaction has already been propagating, but it is some kind of a of an angle that we can use to measure. So we did that, and what is interesting here is we're plotting on the y-axis the duration of a transaction in the mempool in seconds. We start here in April 2022, and we differentiate between a censored transaction. In this particular case, I think we exclusively focus on Tornado Cash transactions, and non-censored transactions, so no non-Tornado Cash transaction. There are two events that happened in the meantime of this measurement here. There's one, these are the OFAC sanctions for Tornado Cash, and the other one is the Ethereum merge and the proposer builder separation, right, which was very close to the Ethereum merge, if not at the same time. So what we see is that the average inclusion delay for TC Tornado Cash transactions, it actually increased from 15.8 seconds to roughly 30 seconds. Right? I guess for usability, it doesn't change too much, whether you wait 15 or 30 seconds, but still it's a measurable increase here. Right? Yeah.
But the non-censored transactions also increase, right?
Exactly. So we don't have the ability, at least I'm not aware, maybe you have an idea. I'm not fully sure how to separate these events, whether the latency increase is mostly due to the PBS system, right, or the merge, or because these two events happened at the same time, right? So we can only observe their accumulated impact on the system. We do not know how they would look like independently of each other.
And maybe additionally, did you factor in the gas costs that were paid by those transactions?
So I assume you're implying that Tornado Cash users have increased their gas price costs, right? And it's actually a great idea to normalize, so to speak, the inclusion latency based on how much is being paid. We haven't looked at that. Good point. Yeah. So yeah, we just observed that kind of here these distributions have shifted a bit. So both censored and non-censored have, but in particular the censored look quite different. I mean, before they were rather similar, the two distributions as well, right? And here you can see how they became more like a potato shape style, maybe. Right. Okay, so this was the confirmation latency. Now, what about the denial of service? So let's say we have a high-level idea, right? We want to give work to somebody, but we don't want to pay for it. Right? So let's just somebody do the work to validate a transaction and make sure they cannot take our money to pay for the transaction fees. Right? And there's a second component to a denial of service that we would need. It's a leverage component. So we want that the transaction creation, so creating the transaction to ask somebody to do the work, should be cheaper than actually doing the work. In other words, it should be cheaper in CPU terms to create a transaction, meaning to create the data, to sign the transaction, than verifying whether a transaction is semantically correct and whether the signature is valid. Right? So if we have those two components, right, then we should be able to DOS a node in the network. And if I'm referring to a node, I'm rather informally speaking here about various different entities in the network. So a node could be a forwarding node, right, that just forwards data. It could be a validator, it could be a relayer, a searcher, a builder. Any of these nodes could really be DOSed if they have some kind of a if we can ask them to do the work without them taking our money afterwards. So does anybody have an idea how we can ask a node to perform work but not tax us afterwards? Invalid transactions are fine, but they're not forwarded. We want things to be broadcast right in the network. So if we know that the node is, yeah?
We give them a sanction transaction, which is technically valid, but they don't want to execute it.
Exactly, right. So we perform some kind, we construct a transaction that does some complicated logic that doesn't really matter, but maybe by the end of the transaction we involve Tornado Cache or something that they wouldn't be happy to include in their blocks or they would censor, right? So that way we force the nodes to perform the work of validating the transaction, likely until the end, which takes CPU time from them. But since they want to censor the transaction, they cannot include it in the blockchain, which implies that they cannot ask for money to be paid, at least according to current EVM standards. Right? This can be changed, but at least according to the current spec. So on a very high level, right? So we have an attacker, and he sends a transaction to a censoring validator. And if the censoring validator is including that transaction, right? Censoring that transaction, then it should execute some complex code and then send the funds to Tornado Cache, for example, right? Which is censored. And otherwise, we can, if it's a non-censoring validator, we can try to execute some simple code that costs as little as possible, so that our costs of attacking the network is not that high. Right? So we can make this differentiation here. And the way that we do this differentiation is because we, based on empirical data, we can measure who of the validators are performing censorship and who are not with Tornado Cache, right? As we have seen previously on the figures. So verifying a transaction that does not involve, verifying the transaction is expensive, right? And then this code is run, and then later we return this. This code may return, oh, it should actually be censored, and then the damage is done already on the validator side. Right? So this is a very high-level view on how this could work. Yeah. Question?
Sorry, to understand, isn't the code by definition should be agnostic to validator? How do you distinguish the code?
So it depends, right, on how the validator is executing the transaction. So you could, for example, I think you can. It's true, actually. You don't have a differentiator on the validator side, right? So I think you do have one on the. So you do know whether a block is mined, but there's no differentiation at execution time, actually. Right, I would need to review that. That's true. Right. So in that case, the execution would run. So in that case, we cannot differentiate between. So let's say the transaction. Yeah. So the question was, at execution time, how do you differentiate between which validator is executing the transaction, right, or is validating the transaction? Because typically the validation process does not involve any account from the validator, right? Therefore, you cannot really differentiate. So, but in any case, what you can do is you can create a transaction that is sent out to all the validators, and they will execute it. And those validators who censor your transaction, they will not be able to claim funds for your execution. And those who execute the transaction and are happy to include it, they will be able to ask for funds from your transaction execution. Yeah. Question?
Is that happening at the smart contract level, or is that happening before the actual smart contract is executed?
So this, I need to re-look into this, but I think we cannot differentiate at validation time. So that this is not correct, right? I think we had an idea, but I need to double check again why I wrote that here. Yeah. So I would just follow this route here. So we execute the complex code, and there's always the transfer to, for example, Tornado Cache. Right? So the important part is here that we can create a computationally expensive transaction, and that the creation of that transaction is cheaper than its validation, right? So if we compare them, so we have a transaction creation time, so we craft the transaction data and we sign the transaction, and on the verification time we have 3 other components, right? So we have the AVM execution time, the different opcode gas costs, CPU time, and then the signature verification time. Right. So with this we kind of looked into a so we tried to build a smart contract here, which does a complicated logic. So computationally complex part here of our smart contract is the following here, where we do the block hash of a number, right? And we do some XOR operation. At the end of the day, this is just some complex Solidity code that we try to build. And what we found is that by running this code, which takes roughly 4.8 here to times 10 to the power 5 minus 5 seconds, whereas the validation of this code took about 0.16 seconds. So the contract creation time is the transaction creation time based on this contract that calls the function DOS is much cheaper than the transaction validation time. So on the validator side, right, a validator who would receive this transaction and who needs to validate it, this would take quite a bit longer. And this is the essence of a DOS attack, right? So you want to have this leverage where the transaction validation time takes much longer than the transaction creation time, right? Because if you're an attacker, what you want to do is to create many of these transactions. Now the question is, what happens if, let's assume, just for the sake of this experiment, if all the validators are censoring, right? All the validators are censoring Tornado Cash transactions. How expensive would that attack be? Exactly, right? Because nobody would include the transaction, and you can ask any node to perform some computation. Now, in practice, the cost will not be zero because there will be always, or likely, some validators or nodes that are accepting Tornado Cash transactions, so you can't fully rule out the costs, right? So that's why it's important to actually include this kind of question?
What's the intuition for using the block Coinbase on MineAT?
Excuse me?
What's the intuition for using the block Coinbase on MineAT? Well, on should ask block Coinbase.
So, yeah, I mean, this is basically related to the previous question, right? Whether we can differentiate between which miner is validating that transaction. So, I assumed, and again, this is something I need to double check, right? I assumed, Maya?
Yeah, I looked at the code. You check the block.coinbase, so you can see the block creator when the code is running. You can see who the block reward is going to. The first transaction goes to my validator.
Right. I think this is the missing piece of the puzzle that I was not remembering. Thank you, Maya. If you're a block builder, right, or a validator in general, you need to get somehow the reward, right, for your block and also for the transaction fees. No, for the block, not for the transaction fees. So in general, this first transaction in the block that you include is the Coinbase transaction, right? The Coinbase transaction pays out the block reward to the validator, and it seems, and this is probably what I forgot earlier, is that you can, in Solidity, you can access the Coinbase of the block that you're being mined, right? And I assume that this is how you can then differentiate which of the miners are currently validating your transaction, right? So, and this would allow you to discriminate between a censoring miner and a non-censoring miner, because you again, from the previous experiment, you can kind of statistically guess who of the validators are being censoring and who are not. Right? Great. Question?
I was just wondering, like, if I'm a sensor, maybe instead of running the transaction, I should do some static analysis. Yeah, that's an nitpick.
Right. So thank you so much. I mean, now the cat and mouse game starts, right? So we have somebody who wants to DOS the network. We have other people that want to censor, but they don't want to be DOSed, right? And then you might need to start to search, like you can do just a string search for what does it do, which contracts does it interact with. Then the attacker will start to generate the address at runtime, right, to obfuscate that it's actually interacting with the tornado cache contract. Then maybe you can do some static analysis. But again, this is really a cat and mouse game, I guess, right? There may be also some false positives, yeah. But in general, I mean, we haven't tested this on the live network for obvious reasons. This is the execution, the creation and execution and the validation times. This is what we've measured locally on our nodes. I'm also not sure, and this should still be done, to what degree this would deteriorate the CPU time on a Geth node, right? So like full integration end to end, this could be elaborated in the local network that we haven't done. But I just feel there's a glimpse of hope for permissionless networks, because it seems that censorship introduces a DOS vector against those entities that are censoring, and that's great, no? I mean, this is precisely what we want, right? We want the system to be permissionless, maybe, right? I mean, at least some of us. So, yeah, I feel like this is at least it's a beautiful result if we can de-incentivize censorship through such economic means, right? I have to say, entities in the space are already prepared for such denial of service attacks. Notably, relayers such as flashbots, they have two types of accounts. So they have just normal accounts, and they have, I think, privileged accounts, depending on how many bundles you send to them. If you misbehave, if you didn't misbehave, then they will put you into this preferred category of accounts, right? So with this kind of DOS, you would only be able to DOS the first set of nodes that kind of filter your transactions, not the preferred list, I suppose, right? But again, it's just a matter of how expensive the attack becomes, because you can always create many accounts, increase their reputation, and attack later on, right? So it really just increases the cost of an attacker. Maya?
Why not deny service every validator? Like, if I'm a validator and I want to be the only person validating because I want the rewards, I know one epoch in advance who will be the validators. Why won't I create a transaction just like this for every validator and spend their time and then have them like lose time, lose transactions, and I refill their rewards?
Right. So when you say every validator, I guess you mean
every validator in the following epoch, like, or whatever. I can construct this transaction and set the address of that validator.
Right. But I guess you only want to do this if you, I mean, ideally you only want to do this for those validators who are censoring, right?
No, why? If I just like I want to mess with the
you have to pay.
Because exactly, right? That's what I was referring to. Because if you target those that do not censor, then you will have to pay, right? Because this transaction will succeed. It will just not do the computationally expensive loop here, because there's this if should DOS condition, right, in line 20. So yeah.
So this is just an attack vector in general. I can attack non-censoring. I can decide to do should DOS however way I want. So if I'm an attacker, I can use this as an attack.
But the goal is to reduce your costs, right?
No, I mean, I could define should DOS in another way if I'm an attacker. I could define should DOS to attack validators. Whoever I want, really. Right.
But he says that you would have to pay for all of this, yes.
Right. So Exactly. So the idea of this attack, and I don't claim any optimality or anything here, right? It's just an example. It's you want to make those nodes that are censoring, you want to make them work and not take any of your funds. And those nodes that are not censoring, you want to pay them just a little bit, right? Because in this kind of example, we assume that we just send this transaction out and we do not know who is the next validator necessarily, right? But it can be optimized, this kind of attack, by, as Maya said, we can only send it out if we know that the next validator will be censoring, which is possible to figure out.
So there's a standard defense against this type of attack where the person submitting transactions has to provide a proof of work that takes 0.1 seconds to do. To create a transaction now, it's going to take you 0.1 seconds. And now the timings are equalized.
Indeed. So we could, as Dan said, we could introduce a client-side proof of work, all right, which would increase the cost of an attack. I think this wasn't Dwork introducing this for spam mitigation of email, right? But that would also require consensus changes, I guess, no? Right, okay.
No, this is an attack on the builder. The builder.
All right. I guess we can still, we could bypass the builder, right? If the validator is happy with that. But you're right, most validators are using builders nowadays. Right. 2 minutes? Okay, perfect. I mean, yeah, I'm really kind of done. I just wanted to ask what can possibly go wrong, right? So we already answered the questions, what if every node censors, or if all the validators censor, then if all the validators censor, we have a free denial of service attack of the entire network, right? You can send out a complicated transaction that at the end pays somewhat to Tornado Cash, and they will all execute this, but cannot take your money. And then it's a cat and mouse game, as we discussed, right? If all the relayers censor, then they probably have some reputation, some account reputation that they can use to mitigate that on their side. But still, it would incur costs to accept new accounts, right? But it would be great to quantify the cost to DOS the entire network. So we have some first estimates, but I don't think they're ready to be shared yet publicly. I also would like to increase our confidence on for example, DOSing nodes in real world, right? I mean, on your local real world network, not on mainnet. I'm sorry to not be clear here. Yeah, but I think it's a super exciting area to work in and to understand what kind of properties do we get from censorship, or what kind of censorship properties do we at all have? And I haven't seen any papers on that out there yet either, right? So yeah, it's really, I think, super exciting and the fundamental property of permissionless blockchains.
If all or like the majority of validators decide to censor, then couldn't they also just agree to still collect the fees and just not mark the transaction?
Very good question. So the question is, if all of the validators censor, couldn't they make a hard fork or some kind of a fork where they agree that now we can take fees without executing the transaction? But I think that may introduce maybe some unwanted side effects. I'm not sure. I haven't thought too deeply about this yet, right? But so you kind of propose to take fees for not executing a transaction, right?
You can't do that. You need to run the logic that, like, you need the permission to split the funds, and the permission is given within the transaction. Right? You can't take funds without running the transaction. You don't include the transaction.
I mean, you could technically change, right, the what the blockchain accepts as a valid transaction and whatnot, right? So you could say if the transaction involves Tornado Cash, you can mine it and you can take the fees for it, but you do not make the transfer, right?
You can add like an ignore bit or something.
Yeah, it would be kind of an ignore transaction, but I'm not sure what the side effects are, right?
There's logic for this atomic execution, where like last step fails and everything gets invalidated.
Right.
So basically, that mechanism I think should work for you're making very transparent that you're censoring some address
by doing that. Everyone agrees that it's censoring.
But again, yeah, we would need to change the consensus mechanism, I think, as of now. So the current spec wouldn't allow for that. But I fully agree. There are rooms to change in order to tax like such DOS transactions. Absolutely. For nodes that want censorship. Yeah. I hope it will get too complicated. Okay, thank you. Yeah.